neurological level, as I said yesterday, the reptilian brain, the part of our system which controls our nervous system, the sympathetic, parasympathetic, the autonomic nervous system, our natural inclinations for protection, survival, our respiration, heartbeat, all of these natural things that happen without us thinking about it. The reptilian level. The mammalian part of the brain relates to the emotional body, feelings, affect, tears, happiness, joy, wanting to be held. The emotional part of our being, the mammalian brain, it's really usually referred to. Feelings, emotions, right? Is that clear? Is that a good description? Also, you know what I'm talking about, right? And then the neocortex, the idea, realm of ideas, thought, ideas, ego, principles. And all three of these must work together with integrity to be whole. The modern approach to trauma recognizes that something can happen. Post-traumatic stress is a good example. Post-traumatic stress, or let's even take the example of say an automobile accident when you're rear-ended and you get whiplash. How many of you have been rear-ended in a car and have had whiplash? In the studies of whiplash, the degree of symptom, the symptom picture, right? The degree of disability that comes from that potentially is so intense in relation to the kind of actual physical impact that it led to this kind of understanding that there's something more at work than just the physical injury. There's a phenomena that's known as the high-rise syndrome. Do you know the high-rise syndrome? High-rise syndrome is something that people who study, it came out of studies of people, with firefighting techniques and people that have to jump out of high-rise buildings that were on fire, and they were developing methods, what's the best way to catch them? Is it a big net? Is it a big balloon that's blown up with a target? That's one of the ones they came up with, a big balloon with targets, and people would jump out. And they found that there were still a lot of injuries, many injuries people were happening, and in a lot of the studies and films and in the examining what was happening, someone came up and discovered what they call the high-rise syndrome, which was the fact that people who jumped from these buildings were not breaking their limbs, their legs and their arms on the impact with the thing. They were breaking them before they hit the ground. Right? Think of that. It's pretty awesome, isn't it?
How do they do that?
By tensing their muscles and by anticipation, by such tension. Does anybody know that strychnine, the action of strychnine, how it works? Strychnine is a poison that poisons the nervous system, right? Right? It affects the nervous system. But did anyone know the fact of how most people die when they take strychnine? From the intensity of the contraction of the muscles. Some very often breaking their own back. The human body is capable on both directions of extraordinary things. So trauma, like the rear end, the whiplash, boom, the shock of that, the way the body takes that in, and the way the body can hold that is one of the reasons for the intensity and the chronicity of the injury of whiplash and the response of it. And that's because in the nervous system, there is a charge that has to do with that initial shock that does not get discharged. And so it reiterates itself in the musculature, in the emotions, et cetera, over and over and over and over, and then becomes established on all of those levels. It's the great old Hitchcock movies where the person, that you say, bluebell, and they go into this great state of distress because bluebells were present when, some horrible thing happened to them. The trigger thing, or the Manchurian Candidate. This is an old, the early, as psychology as it started making its way into the popular mainstream. So in the shock trauma therapy that I work with, primarily we've come to learn methods by observing animals in nature. Animals in nature can be traumatized very severely and recover very rapidly. But if we observe their recovery, in the process of recovery, they go through very specific actions and processes that can be identified as a release of the trauma from the nervous system. Shaking, trembling, moving of the skin, etc., etc. Also, trauma can be in respect to unfulfilled actions that are stored in the nervous system, much in the same way that commands are cued in the printer from a computer. I'm sorry I have to use that as a metaphor. I really am sorry, because I'd rather use the human body as a metaphor and other things as metaphors, but that doesn't work. So here's an example of that. Large animals, when they tranquilize large animals to tag them, to put tags, you know how they do this thing if they want to track where they are and their habits, so they'll tag the ear, polar bear, whatever it is, they'll tranquilize them. So the polar bear is running along, boom, they shoot a tranquilizer, the polar bear goes out, they tag it. The people who work with those animals have learned a principle, which is when the tranquilizer wears off, they must be out of the area of the animal. They must not be. In other words, as the tranquilizer wears off, it's not that they're in danger of being hurt by the animal, they have to be out of the vicinity so the animal is not interrupted in its natural fulfillment of the unfinished actions that they were engaged in. So the polar bear's running, boom, they go out. When that polar bear comes out of the tranquilizer, this is useful information for anesthesiologists, and I think they're aware of it too. The polar bear then goes through the motions, finishes the motions that were there recorded in the nervous system before he comes back to. If he does not do that, and if they don't allow him to do that, or if they interrupt that process, not only will he will not survive. He will not survive. He will not be functionable enough to function as a polar bear and survive following that. That's how extreme it is. So same with us, we have unfulfilled actions. If we do not release them some way, remember I was talking about how the charge up of the nervous system and the release of the nervous system by standing. That is successful discharge of the impulses. So a child is told by the parents, you must do that, and child, they want to do that because they're so frustrated because they're told, don't do this, don't do this, do this. Okay, now if it's a healthy child and they've had the right, holding and touch and all, and they're well grounded, then they'll let that anger and that impulse go. But if they've not been healthy, have been fed on TV and they've been kept from all that's natural and they're living in an unnatural, and they're not grounded and they don't successfully release, then what's going to happen is that impulse for kicking is still going to be there.